We briefly talked about midpoint last class, where we discussed that midpoint meant that it was the middle point, meant that it was directly in the middle of two other points. So there's two ways that we can calculate the midpoint. One is that if we have the midpoint on a number line, you guys are familiar with the number line, then we would use the formula a plus b divided by 2. And that just means you take your 2 points that you're given, divide them by 2. When you think of midpoint, you've got to think of the average, just like if you were to take the average of two of your test scores to see what your actual grade would be. You would add the two test scores and you would divide by 2. That's the midpoint, that's the average. So if we're looking for the midpoint or the average of a to b, we're coming down here. I would take the coordinates of a, which is negative 12. I would add that to the coordinate of b, which is negative 7. And then I would divide both values by 2. Now, most of you are going to be tempted to pick up your calculators and just plug all of that in. You'll say negative 12 plus a negative 7 divided by 2. That's wrong. You cannot stick all that in your calculator, because what's going to happen is your calculator is only going to take the negative 7 and divide it by 2. We want it to take the entire numerator, negative 12 plus a negative 7, divide that whole thing by 2. So if you're going to use your calculator and you're not going to do the math in your head, then you need to set a parentheses at the numerator. So it'll take the entire value and divide by 2. So your midpoint would be negative 9.5. And if we look, negative 9.5 is about right here. So we should be able to plot it and see that it does look like it's directly in the middle of A and B. But you shouldn't have to use your calculator when you're doing simple calculations like this. If we're finding the midpoint of BF, B once again is negative 7, and F is over here at 12. So we would take the two values, negative 7, and add it to a positive 12 and divide by 2. Well, negative 7 plus 12 is a positive 5, and we would take that number and divide by 2. So you could do that, add them in your head first, and then divide that number by 2, which is 2.5. Okay, I'd like for you to pause the video and try both example 3 and 4, and then unpause it and see if you get what I get. So for number 3, you should have gotten 4, and for number 4, you should have gotten 8. If you didn't get either of those responses, please raise your hand and ask us or a friend. The next way you're going to see midpoint represented is if you don't have a number line, but you have a coordinate plane. Remember, this is your XY coordinate plane. And the formula for that, and you can actually ignore the subscripts 1 and 2, because for midpoint, you're just going to add the x values, divide by 2, add the y values, divide by 2. You're going to give me a midpoint on a coordinate plane. So you should have an xy value when you're finished. So we'll work this example together. So what we're going to do is always label x and y for each of our coordinates so we don't confuse them. And we take our x values, we have negative 2, we add them together, so I'm going to do negative 2 plus the other x value, which is 3. I'm going to divide that by 2. Then I'm going to figure out my midpoint of my y coordinate. So I take my y values, 4 and 1, I add them together, and I divide by 2. So then I have negative 2 plus 3. Well, negative 2 plus 3 is 1, divided by 2. And I have 4 plus 1, which is 5, divided by 2. And if you're not positive, 1/2 in the calculator is going to come out to be about 0.5. And 5/2 in the calculator comes out to be 2.5. So then I would just graph this coordinate, and it should look like it's directly in the middle of the segment that they gave me. So I'm going to go This is my x value, this is my y value. I'm going to go over about a half, and I'm going to go up 1, 2 and a half. And it should be pretty clear that that is directly in the middle of the segment that's been given to me. Okay, so first what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to make this a segment. So get your straight edge out, just connect the two coordinates together. Because we're going to plot the midpoint on this, and it'd be easier if we had a nice straight segment going around it. And then we're going to find the coordinates of the midpoint of AB. So we should be left with an XY coordinate. So we take our x values. Let's first label x and y for each. Take our x values, divide by 2. So -3 plus 5 divided by 2. And then we add our y values together. I know I kind of covered it up here, but it's a -2. So we take -2 and we add that to our +4, divide by 2. So -3 plus 5, that's a +2. We're going to divide that by 2. -2 plus 4, that's also a +2. We're going to divide by 2. So our final coordinates for our midpoint are 1, 1. And I'm going to plot that 1, 1. And it should look like it's directly in the middle of the segment that's been given to us. Alright, so I'd like you to pause the video for number 6. Start by making a line segment here so that when we find our midpoint, we can plot it on our line segment. So pause the video, find the midpoint, and plot it. And make sure your answer is the same as mine. So we should have gotten -1 and -1.5, and your midpoint should be about right here. It should look like it's directly in the middle. If you didn't get that, raise your hand or ask your neighbor. Okay, now examples 7 and 8 I'm just going to have you do on your own. But this is an example of when they're just going to give you the coordinates. They're not going to have them on a coordinate plane. So it's exactly the same thing. You're finding the midpoint of the segment, and these are your endpoints. So pause the video. I want you to try both number 7 and number 8 and make sure you get the same answer as I do. Okay, and we should have gotten 2, 3 for number 7 and 2, -2 for number 8. If you didn't, raise your hand or ask a neighbor. Okay, and a very common example, and this one you'll see on the SOL for sure, it's on it every single year, is sometimes they're going to give you the midpoint and an endpoint, and you have to figure out what the other endpoint is called. So I use what's called the EMO method, where you list from top to bottom the endpoint, the midpoint, and your job is to find out what the other endpoint is. So they always give you the endpoint, they always give you the midpoint, and you're looking for the other endpoint. So you list them. Well, this is on the end, so it's going to go right here, -1, 7. This coordinate is in the middle, so it goes in the middle as well. So 2, 4. And then you have to figure out, because if it's directly in the middle, it's going to have the same amount of distance in between both points. So you have to figure out, how does a -1 become a 2? Well, clearly we had to add some number to it. And if you look at a number line, you have -1, 0, 1, 2. So in order to get to 2, we would have had to add 1, 2, 3. So we went up 3 to get to 2. So that means we're going to go up 3 again to get to our other endpoint. So we take 2 and add 3 to it. Same thing with our y values. How does a 7 become a 4? Well, 7, 6, 5, 4. We're clearly going down on the number line, so this becomes a subtraction problem. And we would go 1, 2, 3. So we subtract 3. So now, starting at 4, we would subtract 3 again. So we would get 1. So our other endpoint is 3, 1, which would be about 1, 2, 3, up 1. Okay, so we'll do one more example together. Find the coordinates of the other endpoint, so we know we're doing the EMO method. And given the midpoint M, we're looking for the other endpoint. So A is going to be our endpoint, 4, 3. The midpoint is going to be -1, -1, and we're looking for the other endpoint. So how does a -4 become a -1? Well, we're going up on the number line, and we would be going up by 3. So starting at -1, we're going to go up by 3 again. -1 plus 3 is a +2. 3 becoming a -1 is a subtraction problem. So how does a 3 become a -1? Well, we would subtract a total of 4. Then from the midpoint that we were given of our y value, we subtract 4 again. So we get -5. So our final answer would be 2, -5. Alright, I'd like for you to pause the video and try number 10 on your own. Okay, and you should have gotten a -7 and a -1. If you didn't, raise your hand or ask a neighbor. Alright, and finally we're going to talk about distance, and another word that you're going to see used exactly the same thing as distance is length. So if you're asked to find the length or the distance between 2 points on a coordinate plane, then you're using what's going to be called the distance formula. The coordinate plane, when you're looking for distance, you're going to be given a value. Like if I said, how many miles do you run? You give me the distance, 10 miles, 5 miles, 7 miles. It's going to be a single number. It's not like the midpoint where you're giving me a point on the coordinate plane. You're giving me a final distance. So you're not going to have, your answer is not going to be an XY answer. It's just going to be some number that represents the length of this segment. Okay, so here's the formula, and I'll show you how to apply it for this first example. When you see it just has 2 capital letters, for example, find CD, that means find the length of CD, which means use the distance formula. So what we're going to do is we first start by identifying the coordinates. This is my x value, this is my other x value, this is my y value, and this is my other y value. Once again, these subscripts aren't going to matter as long as you've identified x's and y's properly. So we first start by drawing the square root, and then we take our x value, make sure you use parentheses, take one of your x values, -3, then put a minus sign down, and then your other x value, 4. End your parentheses and then square it, plus your y values squared. So we do 2 minus a -1, and we square it. Now you can put all of this in your calculator, but you have to watch carefully how I do it. First, second x squared. Second x squared will give you your square root. Then you're going to use a double set of parentheses, and then you type in this, -3 minus 4, close one of the parentheses and square it, put your plus sign in there, and then do another set of parentheses, 2 minus a -1, close your parentheses again, square it, then add another parentheses. Press enter. When we find distance, we are finding to the nearest tenths in this class. So it's going to be approximately, that symbol means approximately, because we are going to round, 7.6. Your tenths place is this first digit here, 7.6. Okay, so now I'd like for you to pause the video and try number 2. Using the distance formula, you're going to find the length. Length and distance are the same thing, remember. And you just stick it all in your calculator once you've set up and written the equation correctly, as I did here. Okay, pause your video and see if you get what I get. Okay, and you should have gotten 7.8. Okay, and then the last way that you'll see this problem given is if up above they give you a set of coordinates and they say find AB. Remember, the 2 capital letters means find the distance. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use the distance formula for both of these. Okay, so extra practice, I'd like for you to pause the video, try both number 3 and number 4, and then unpause the video to see if you get the same answer as I do. Okay, you should have gotten these answers, and these are the ways that you put them in your calculator. If you didn't get this, meaning you didn't get exactly this as I did, because remember we're rounding to the nearest tenths, you need to let one of us know. Okay, you're ready to take your exit quiz on distance and midpoint.